the day Harriet Cooke turned 26. Her mother died owing 3 months of rent on a boarding house in St. John, New Brunswick, and left behind nothing but a wooden trunk, a Bible with the spine cracked clean through, and a debt that the landlord, a gray-faced man named Mr. Foss, was more than happy to explain in detail, while Harriet was still standing in the doorway of the room where her mother had taken her last breath. $740. That was the number. Foss read it from a ledger the way a minister reads scripture, slow and deliberate, like the weight of it was something Harriet needed time to absorb. She looked around the room, the narrow bed, the curtain with the water stain shaped like a boot, the single chair her mother had dragged from the corner of every room they'd ever rented, all the way back to Halifax, because it had belonged to Harriet's grandmother, and that made it worth dragging. No, she didn't say it aloud. There was no point. Foss gave her 2 days to settle the debt or clear out. He said it not unkindly, which was somehow worse. Harriet sat in the chair that had belonged to her grandmother, and she thought about her options the way you do when you're 26 and alone, and the list is shorter than it has any right to be. She could go to her mother's sister in Fredericton, who had made it clear years ago that she considered Harriet's mother a burden, and by extension considered Harriet the same. She could find work in the city, but boarding house work paid little. And a woman alone in St. John in November found herself in a particular kind of precarious that Harriet had seen up close and had no interest in repeating. Or there was the advertisement that Mrs. Purdy downstairs had read to her 2 weeks ago, laughing slightly, as though it were a joke. Widower with 2 children, operating a working cattle and timber property in the interior of New Brunswick, seeks capable woman for employment as household manager. Position is long-term. References not required. Transport provided. Inquire through Clement and Bray, Solicitors, Moncton. Harriet had not laughed. She had thought about it, set it aside, thought about it again. Now she had 2 days and $740 worth of reasons to think about it seriously. She wrote the letter that same evening. She did not embellish. She wrote that she was 26, in good health, capable of cooking, managing accounts, and hard work of most descriptions. She wrote that she was available immediately. She folded the letter and posted it before she could reconsider. The reply came in 4 days, which was faster than she expected. It was written in a hand so spare it was nearly illegible, on paper that had been folded so many times the creases had started to tear. Position is still open. Take the train to Hartley Junction. Ask at the feed store for directions to Croftland. Come prepared for winter. No name, no greeting, no indication of whether this constituted an offer or merely an invitation to present herself for consideration. Harriet packed the wooden trunk, the cracked Bible, and the chair that had belonged to her grandmother. She paid Foss what she could from the small amount she'd saved and told him she'd settle the rest when she was able. He didn't look convinced. She didn't blame him. She took the train north and west on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the first real snow was falling sideways against the windows. Hartley Junction was smaller than St. John. It was smaller than most things Harriet had a word for. 3 streets, a church, a post office, a general store, and a feed store that smelled of grain and leather and cold iron. The man behind the counter looked at Harriet the way people in small places look at strangers, which is to say with complete attention and no expression at all. She asked for directions to the Croftland. He studied her for a moment. Then he said, "You the one Silas Croft sent for?" "I believe so." He gave her directions. 14 miles north, a road that turned to track past the second creek, a gate with a broken hinge that hadn't been fixed in 2 years. She'd know it by the broken hinge. "Is there someone who can take me?" she asked. "Silas'll send someone if you're expected. You expected today?" She showed him the letter. He read it, handed it back. "Could be he forgot what day it was?" he said, not unkindly. "Happens more since Margaret passed. You can wait here or I can send word." He sent word. Harriet sat on a barrel near the stove and waited. And while she waited, she listened to the wind outside testing the walls and thought about the fact that a man capable of forgetting what day someone was arriving was possibly not the most organized employer she could have sought out. Then she thought about $740 and revised her concerns. An hour later, a wagon came. The man driving it was not Silas Croft. He was a boy of maybe 15 with a face full of freckles and the kind of silence that suggested he'd been told specifically not to say anything. He loaded her trunk without being asked. He said his name was Wes, and that was the last thing he said for the entire 14 miles. The road, as promised, turned to track past the second creek. The track climbed through a stand of black spruce, so dense the light went blue and thin, and then it opened out onto a valley that stopped Harriet's thinking for a full minute. It was large. She hadn't expected large. A timber frame house, 2 stories, with a covered porch that wrapped 3 sides. Two barns, one of which appeared to have had its roof repaired recently enough that the new shingles were still pale against the old ones. Fenced pasture running toward a tree line. A kitchen garden, dormant now but planted in straight rows. Evidence, Harriet thought, of someone who had cared. Past tense was the operative word. The porch boards were starting to rot at the edges. One of the fence posts leaned at a 20-degree angle and had been doing so long enough that the wire sagged around it. The windows could use washing. Someone had cared, and then that person had stopped. Wes brought the wagon to a stop near the house. A man appeared in the doorway before they'd quite finished stopping, which suggested he'd been watching them come down the track. He was taller than Harriet had pictured. She wasn't sure why she'd pictured anything, given that a letter with no name wasn't much to go on. With dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that had been weathered into its current arrangement by years of outdoor work, and possibly grief in roughly equal measure. He had a scar through his left eyebrow that pulled it slightly out of alignment. He looked at the wagon, then at Harriet, then at the wagon again, as though doing the calculation of whether this was what he'd asked for. "Miss Cooke," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Croft," she said. He nodded and stepped aside. She took that as an invitation. Inside was worse than the outside. The kind of worse that happens gradually in small failures, each one unremarkable by itself. Dishes on the counter that should have been washed 2 days ago. A boot by the stairs with no companion. A table still holding the remains of what looked like breakfast, though it was now mid-afternoon. The house smelled of wood smoke and something older underneath it. A specific kind of desolation that Harriet associated with places that had once been kept and were no longer. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and took stock. Silas Croft stood in the doorway and watched her take stock. He said, "The room is upstairs, second on the left. Children's room is across. I'm at the end." "How old are the children?" she asked. 12. Twins. She'd known there were 2 children. She hadn't known they were twins. It shouldn't have mattered, but it landed differently. "When can I meet them?" "They're in the barn." A pause. "They may not come in for supper. When they don't want to meet someone, they find reasons to be elsewhere." Harriet took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. "Then I'll start on supper," she said, "and they can come in when they're ready." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not quite relief. More like surprise that he'd bothered to conceal. He left. She started on supper. The twins came in at dark, and not quietly. The girl came first, all sharp elbows and suspicion, with her father's gray eyes and a set to her jaw that suggested she'd already decided several things about Harriet that weren't going to be easy to revise. Her name was Ivy. Her brother was Edmund, broader than his sister, with a crease between his eyebrows that looked permanent. He crossed his arms in the doorway and looked at Harriet the way she imagined he looked at most problems, directly with a kind of hostile patience. "You're the one Papa hired," Ivy said. "I am," Harriet said. "The last one left after 6 weeks. I know." Silas had mentioned it in a subsequent, extremely brief letter. "The one before that lasted 3 weeks. That's useful information," Harriet said, and went back to the stove. Neither of them left. That was something. The soup was good. She could tell from the way Edmund ate it that he was trying to appear unimpressed while eating it as quickly as was compatible with appearing unimpressed. Ivy ate more slowly and watched Harriet the whole time, which Harriet found easier to respect than to endure. Silas said almost nothing at supper. He said please and thank you and cleaned his plate, and that was it. After supper, Harriet washed the dishes. The twins disappeared upstairs. Silas stood by the window for a while, looking at something in the dark that Harriet couldn't see. Then he said, without turning, "They run everyone off eventually. I should tell you that plainly." "They might not run me off," Harriet said. "That's what the others said." She dried her hands on the cloth by the sink. "The others weren't me." He looked at her then. In the lantern light, he looked tired in a way that went deeper than one night's sleep could fix. He looked tired in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that some things just couldn't be helped. "Contract says 6 months," he said. "Room, board, and a wage. You decide to leave before that, I'm not going to stop you. And if I stay?" He looked back out the window. "Then we figure out the 6 months after that." Harriet went upstairs. The room was small and cold, but the bed was solid and someone had put clean sheets on it. Recently enough that they still smelled of the outdoors where they'd dried. That was either Silas or Wes, and either way it was a small kindness, and she noted it. The next morning she was up before anyone else. She lit the stove, found the flour in the lard, started biscuits. By the time she heard footsteps on the stairs, the kitchen was warm and smelled of something worth waking up for. Edmund appeared first, stopped dead in the doorway. "Sit down," Harriet said. "Food's almost ready." He sat. A minute later, Ivy appeared and did not sit, just leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed. "I don't like biscuits," she said. "That's fine," Harriet said. "There are eggs." Ivy looked at her for a moment. Then she unfolded her arms and sat down. Silas came in last, looked at the table and said nothing. Just sat and ate with the same quiet attention he'd given his supper the night before. Harriet noticed he took 3 biscuits and ate all of them. The first 2 weeks were an education. Harriet learned the shape of what the house had once been under Margaret Croft's keeping. Good bones, a logical arrangement, the kind of accumulated small decisions that reflected someone who thought about how a household worked and worked with it rather than against it. She learned where things were kept, which was sometimes where they should have been, and sometimes not at all. She found a box of household accounts in the dresser in the parlor that Margaret had kept in a careful hand, noting every purchase and every sale going back 4 years. She almost put it back. Instead, she read it. By the end of the second week, she had a picture of a cattle and timber operation that had been until about 18 months ago, solvent and carefully managed. And then something had shifted. The numbers didn't so much drop as wander, getting harder to track, purchases unlogged, income unaccounted for. The kind of thing that happened when the person who'd been paying attention had stopped paying attention. And this began to press at the edges of Harriet's thinking, when someone had started making sure that certain things weren't logged. She waited until a Sunday evening when the twins were in their room and Silas was sitting by the fire with the look he sometimes had of a man counting the things he didn't know how to fix. She brought the accounts box and sat down across from him. "Your wife kept good records," she said. He looked at the box. She did for the first 2 years. After that, they become harder to follow. Supplies purchased that aren't logged against sale. Timber shipments that don't appear in the receivables column. She set the box on the table between them. Either the records became careless or someone was making sure they were. Silas was very still. "Where did you find those?" "Parlor dresser." "Was I not meant to look at them?" A long silence. The fire shifted. "Margaret was sick," he said at last, slowly, like the words were being pulled out one at a time. "Last year and a half, she was sick and getting worse, and I was either at her side or running the operation and doing neither one well. I stopped watching the numbers." He rubbed the side of his face. "I assumed the losses were because I was distracted. Some of them may be," Harriet said, "but the pattern is too consistent for all of them to be. The losses follow your absences from the property. When you're here, the numbers hold. When you're away, they don't." He looked at the box for a long time. "That's someone who knows our schedule. It's someone who's been waiting for you to be too overwhelmed to notice." Silas stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had started again. "There's a logging operation east of here," he said. "Amos meant Renwick. He's been trying to buy me out for 3 years. Since before Margaret died, and more since. He knows I'm short on men and shorter on time." "Can you prove it's him?" "No, then we need to build the kind of record that makes the pattern undeniable." He turned and looked at her. It was the way he'd looked at her when she'd first arrived, that calculation. But something in it had shifted. "You're talking about watching his operation. I'm talking about watching ours. Every transaction, every loss, every day and time. If it's Renwick, the record will show it." Silas was quiet. Then, "You found this in 2 weeks." "I looked at the numbers," Harriet said simply. "That's what numbers are for." He sat back down. He looked at her across the lamplight and the accounts box with the expression of a man who had been trying to carry something alone. For so long he'd forgotten it had a weight. "All right," he said. "You take the books." Harriet took the books. That night she sat in her room after everyone was in bed and went through the accounts again slowly, with a fresh sheet of paper for her own notes. She heard Ivy get up twice, once for water and once, she suspected, to listen outside Harriet's door. She didn't say anything about it. 3 days later, Ivy knocked. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Tracking where the money goes," Harriet said. "Come in if you want." Ivy came in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the papers. She was 12 years old and grieving and furious, and she had her mother's handwriting, Harriet noticed, the same careful slope to the letters. She must have spent a long time watching her mother write to have learned it so exactly. "Mama kept those," Ivy said. "She kept them well." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "You think someone's stealing from us?" "I think something is wrong with the numbers, and I'm trying to understand what." "Papa doesn't know." "Your papa knows now. We talked about it tonight." Ivy looked at her. The suspicion was still there, but underneath it was something else. Calculation, Harriet thought. This was a 12-year-old who was paying attention to everything, and had decided that the question worth asking wasn't whether Harriet was trustworthy, but whether she was useful. "The last woman," Ivy said, "brought her own sheets and wouldn't eat in the kitchen with us. The one before that read books in the parlor and called us difficult." "Are you difficult?" Harriet asked. "Yes," Ivy said, without a trace of apology. "All right, I'll keep that in mind." Ivy stood up. At the door she stopped. My mother used to stay up late doing those accounts, she said. We used to sneak down and watch her through the doorway. She never saw us. Or she saw you and didn't say anything, Harriet said. Ivy considered this. Then she went to bed. Winter pressed in hard after that. The temperature dropped and the roads turned to ice, and the cattle required twice the labor to keep alive. And the timber crews who worked Silas's eastern stands came in with cracked hands and frostbitten ears, and the kind of news that needed immediate attention and immediate decision. Silas was gone more than he was home, sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3, coming back with ice in his beard, and the particular exhaustion of a man who was managing too many things with too few hours. Harriet kept the house. She kept the fires, managed the stores, put food on the table morning and night. She kept the accounts. She tracked every transaction, every loss, every gap in the records, with the careful attention of someone who understood that the difference between chaos and order was often just the willingness to write things down. The twins were changing. Not quickly, not warmly, but changing. Edmund started appearing in the kitchen while Harriet was cooking, not asking for anything, just present. Occasionally handing her things without being asked. Ivy started coming downstairs at night and sitting at the kitchen table while Harriet worked through the accounts, not speaking, just there, the way a cat occupies the same space as a person without it constituting company. One night, a late January storm that had started as wind and become something meaner, Silas came home at midnight from moving cattle in from the north pasture. He was frozen in a way Harriet hadn't seen before, a white frost on his collar and his gloves so stiff she had to help him pull them off. His hands, when she got to them, were white where they should have been red. "Sit," she said. He sat. She got the blankets, the hot water, the tea with a measure of whiskey from the bottle he kept on the shelf above the woodbox. She wrapped his hands in the warmed cloths the way her grandmother had taught her once for a cousin who'd come in off the ice too long after dark. He sat there and let her do it, too cold to do much else. After a while he said, "The men are in the bunkhouse, all of them." "Good," she said. "You waited up. Someone had to know what time you came in." He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were very dark and tired, and something else she didn't have a word for. "My wife used to say the same thing." Harriet wrung out the cloths and rewrapped them. "Tell me about her," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he did. Margaret Croft had come to the property as a young woman, 20 years old, from a family in Moncton with a father who thought she was wasting herself on a man who worked in timber. She had proved him wrong by being better at the business side of timber than anyone Silas had hired. She had kept the books, managed the relationships with the buyers, hired and let go of the logging crews with a judgment that had saved the operation twice from men who'd have stripped the value out of it. She had raised the twins while also doing all of this. She had been, Silas said, like something that happened to a place rather than someone who just lived in it. She had died in February of last year from a lung condition that had been coming for 2 winters before it finally finished the argument. The twins had watched her get worse and been told that some things couldn't be helped, which was true and which didn't help. Silas had kept the operation running by sheer force of whatever it is that keeps men going when they don't have a reason, beyond the fact that they haven't stopped yet. When he finished talking, he was quiet for a while. The fire popped. Harriet refilled his tea. "You're doing her job now," he said. "The accounts, the house, you know that." "I'm not trying to do it like her," Harriet said. "I'm trying to do it like me." "Which might be different, might be better in some ways," Silas said. "Different ways." He went upstairs. Harriet stayed by the fire a while longer, thinking about a woman she'd never met whose handwriting she'd been reading for weeks. Then she banked the fire and went to bed. 3 weeks later, she found the proof. A crate of tools that had been logged as delivered, but that Wes swore hadn't arrived. Harriet went to the storage barn herself and found the empty space where the tools should have been, and on the floor, a scrap of paper that had blown into the corner, a delivery note, signed and dated, for a destination that wasn't Silas's property. It was a Renwick property name, the logging camp northeast of them that everyone in Hartley Junction knew Amos Renwick ran. She showed Silas that evening. He read it twice. "He signed for our tools and had them sent to his own camp," Silas said, "and falsified the delivery record so it would look like they'd come to us." Silas set the paper down very carefully. "I need to think. We need to bring this to the constable in Hartley Junction. Renwick has relationships there. Then we go to Moncton," Harriet said. "We take the accounts and we take this note, and we let someone with authority look at the pattern. It's clear enough now." Silas was quiet. She could see him working through it, the way a man does when he's been on the defensive. For so long the idea of actually pressing back feels unfamiliar. Edmund appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with his arms crossed. He was 12 and tried to look older. "What's Renwick done?" he asked. "He's been stealing from us," Harriet said. Edmund's jaw set. "I knew it. I saw his man at the fence line last October. Silas looked at his son. You saw someone? Near the east pasture. I thought they were just cutting through. I should have said something. You can say something now, Harriet said. Write down what you saw. Date, time, what the man looked like, where he was. That goes in the record. Edmund looked at his father. Silas nodded once. Edmund went for paper. Ivy appeared in the hall, listening. She'd been listening the whole time, Harriet suspected. The trip to Moncton took the better part of a week, between the roads and the weather, and the time required with the solicitors and the provincial authorities, who looked at the accounts and the delivery note and the notes Edmund had provided, and asked a series of questions that Silas answered in his flat, direct way. Harriet answered the questions about the accounts. She had been keeping them for 6 weeks by then and knew them as well as she'd ever known anything. The solicitor, a dry man named Fletcher with an excellent memory for numbers, said, "This is a clear pattern of fraudulent diversion. With the delivery note, it becomes criminal. The question is whether you want to pursue it through the courts or through a negotiated settlement." Silas said, "I want it stopped, and I want it on record that it happened." "Courts, then," said Fletcher. They went home. Silas rode out to tell his closest neighboring ranchers what was happening, and 3 of them came back with stories of their own losses that they'd attributed to bad luck or careless management. They hadn't known to connect them to Renwick. The pattern became, in the space of a week, considerably larger than Silas had understood. The night he came home from the last of those visits, he sat at the kitchen table and said quietly, "He's been doing this to all of us for years, not just me. I should have seen it." "You were trying to keep your family alive," Harriet said. "That's not an excuse. It's not meant to be an excuse, it's a reason." He looked up at her. Outside, the wind was doing something specific and northern against the eaves. The lamp on the table put yellow light across his face, and the chair across the table where Margaret Croft's account book still sat. "You found what I should have found," he said. "I was able to look at it, without already having carried it for 3 years," Harriet said. "That's the difference." Edmund appeared in the doorway again. He did this, appeared at significant moments, with the accuracy of someone who spent a great deal of time listening for them. "Are we going to court?" he asked. "We are," Silas said. Edmund nodded with a satisfaction that was, Harriet thought, remarkably adult for a 12-year-old. He went back down the hall. The investigation took 3 months. Renwick fought it, which Silas had expected, with lawyers from Fredericton, and a series of counterclaims that were effective at complicating things without being effective at actually disproving anything. The delivery note remained, the account records remained, the testimony of 4 neighboring operations remained. In the meantime, the property began to change. Harriet had been making small repairs since November, things she noticed and fixed without announcement, a hinge, a porch board, a window latch. In March, she organized a work week with Wes and 2 of the hired men to address the fence lines before the spring mud made them impassable. She found that Edmund, given specific tasks and left alone to do them, was a serious and capable worker. He didn't need to be told twice, and he didn't need to be watched. Ivy was different. Ivy was the kind of help that came attached to opinions, which Harriet had decided early on was the more valuable kind. When Harriet made decisions about the stores, or the garden, or the spring planting, Ivy weighed in with information about what had worked before and what hadn't, delivered in the tone of someone who expected the information to be used. One afternoon in April, Ivy came in from the garden with dirt up to her elbows and said, "You're staying, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. "Yes," Harriet said, "even after the 6 months, even after." Ivy was quiet for a moment, pulling off her boots. "Edmund likes you," she said. "He won't say so, but he does. He told Mrs. Purdy at the general store that you made the best pie he'd ever eaten, and then he pretended he hadn't said it." Harriet kept her face entirely neutral. "I'll keep that in mind. I like you too," Ivy said, in the tone of someone admitting something mildly embarrassing. "You're not like the others. You don't look at this place like it's something you're tolerating. You look at it like—" She stopped. "Like what?" "Like you're planning something for it." She pulled her second boot off. "Mama used to look at it like that." Harriet put down the thing she was holding and looked at this girl with her mother's handwriting and her father's eyes and the particular dignity of someone who had decided to survive something very painful by paying extremely close attention to everything around her. "I'm not your mama," Harriet said. "I know that. I know you're not," Ivy said, with more gentleness than Harriet expected. "But you're something." Renwick's case collapsed in May. The provincial court sided with Silas and the 4 neighboring operations. Renwick was required to pay back the assessed value of what he'd taken, which was substantial, and was barred from operating in the region for 5 years. His lawyers announced an appeal. Fletcher, dry as ever, said the appeal would likely take 2 years to resolve. and that in the meantime the judgment stood. Silas came home from the courthouse in Moncton on a clear evening in late May, when the light was long and gold across the valley, and he stood in the yard for a while before coming in, just looking at the property. Harriet watched him through the kitchen window. She didn't go out. When he came in, the twins were at the table doing their lessons with the seriousness they brought to everything, and he looked at them for a moment, then at the kitchen, clean, warm with supper on stove, and then at Harriet. He said, "It's done." "I know," she said. Fletcher had sent a note. He sat down. Edmund looked up from his work and said, "Did he pay?" "He will." Edmund nodded and went back to his lesson. Ivy, without looking up, said, "Good." Silas watched his children and then looked at Harriet again. He had a way of looking at her now that was different from when she'd first arrived. Less calculation. More the way a person looks at something they've gotten used to the presence of and have quietly decided to be glad for. "The 6 months is up," he said. "I know. And after?" Harriet set the spoon down on the rest beside the stove. She thought about St. John and the boarding house and the number 740, which she'd been paying down slowly from her wages, and which was, by now, nearly gone. She thought about the valley when she'd first seen it through the wagon's canvas. The way it had stopped her thinking. She thought about an account book with a woman's careful handwriting inside it, and a 12-year-old girl who had learned to write the same way by watching. After, she said, "I think we figure out the next 6 months." Silas looked at her steadily. "And the 6 months after that?" She met his eyes. "And those too." Something in him settled then, in the quiet way of something that had been waiting a long time to set down its weight. Over the summer that followed, Harriet learned the full shape of what Silas Croft had built, which was larger than it looked, and more complicated than it seemed, and significantly more valuable than the previous 18 months of Renwick's interference had made it appear. She learned the names of the timber buyers and the cattle agents, and the patterns of the seasons and the specific tendencies of the North Pasture to flood in May. She learned that Edmund was talented with animals in the particular way of someone who communicated better with them than with most people, and that Ivy had a gift for numbers that her mother had had, and that her father would have wasted if someone hadn't suggested she be taught to use it properly. She arranged for a school teacher in Hartley Junction to take Ivy on as an advanced pupil. Ivy went 3 times a week and came home with the expression of someone who has been appropriately challenged for the first time in recent memory. Silas said at the end of July, on an evening when the twins had gone to bed and the summer dark was full of sound from the valley, Margaret would have done this. Found that for Ivy. Ivy would have found it herself eventually, Harriet said. She's that kind of person. He was quiet. They were sitting on the porch in the last of the light. This had become a habit, the sitting after supper, not always talking, sometimes just present in the way of people who have gotten used to each other. "You're planning something for the North Pasture," he said. She blinked. "How did you know that?" "You've walked it 3 times this week," she told him. He listened in the way he always listened to practical things, with his full attention and very little expression. When she was finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "That might work." "It would work," she said. "The drainage change would be the only significant cost. Then we do it in the fall before the ground freezes." They did it in the fall. It worked. The North Pasture held more cattle the following spring than it had in 4 years, which Harriet logged carefully in the account books. She was still keeping the account books. She'd never stopped. In October, Amos Renwick's appeal was rejected. Fletcher sent a note that arrived on a Tuesday, and which Harriet put on Silas's plate at dinner, rather than interrupt whatever he was doing in the barn. He read it at supper and handed it to Edmund, who read it and handed it to Ivy, who read it and set it down and said, "Good," again in exactly the same tone as before, and went back to her food. That night Silas knocked on the door of Harriet's room, which he had not done before. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway with the particular discomfort of a man who has decided to say something and is not accustomed to the exercise. He said, "I want to talk to you about something." "Sit down then," Harriet said. He sat in the chair that had belonged to her grandmother, which she had put in the corner of the room and which no one had commented on. He said, "When I put the advertisement in, I was looking for someone to manage the house, keep the place in expecting. Worse." He stopped. "What?" she said. "Someone who would look at the accounts and find what I'd missed. Someone who would deal with Renwick the way you helped me deal with him. Someone the children would." Another stop, a long one. "They've been good this year," Harriet said. "They've been good because of you, both of them." He looked at his hands. "I know what you came here from. The debt, the boarding house. I know the situation you were in. It doesn't embarrass me," Harriet said. "It shouldn't. I'm not saying it to embarrass you. I'm saying it because." He looked up. Because I want to know if you'd consider staying past the contract. Not as an employee. The room was quiet. Outside, the first frost of autumn was doing its work on the grass. You'd better be specific, Harriet said, about what you mean. Silas Croft was not by nature a man who said things directly when indirectly was an option. But he looked at her in that specific way he had, the one that wasn't calculation anymore, and said, I'd like to marry you, if you'd have me. And I'm asking, not assuming. There's a difference. There is a difference, Harriet agreed. She thought about it for a moment. Not long. I'll think about it properly, she said. But the answer is probably yes. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been a smile if he'd had more practice. That's all I'm asking, he said. The answer was, in fact, yes. The wedding was in November, small, in the church at Hartley Junction, with the minister and a handful of neighbors, and the two timber buyers Silas had worked with longest, who came because they'd heard and thought it warranted attendance. Fletcher the solicitor sent a letter of congratulation so dry it might have been a legal notice, if not for a single line at the end that wished them well with something that in a man like Fletcher passed for warmth. Edmund and Ivy stood on either side of their father and Harriet, not quite touching, in the way of people who are not yet sure how something works, but are willing to find out. Ivy had asked, the week before, a question that she'd clearly been working up to for some time. Are you going to be our mother? Harriet had thought about the right answer to that question. She'd thought about Margaret Croft and her handwriting and the account books and the careful rows in the dormant kitchen garden and all the ways that a person leaves themselves in a place even after they're gone. I'm going to be your Harriet, she said finally, and we'll see what that means. Ivy considered this. Then she said, Mama kept her maiden name in the account books. Even after she married Papa. That sounds like a reasonable thing to do, Harriet said. Ivy went back to what she was doing with the expression of a person who has gotten the answer they were hoping for. The winter that came after the wedding was hard the way northern New Brunswick winters are hard, which is to say without apology. But the house was warm. That was Harriet's doing, the fires banked right, the stores well managed, the supplies logged and tracked and deployed without waste. Small things. Things that didn't get noticed until they didn't get done. Silas noticed them. That was something she hadn't expected. A man who paid attention not just to what was there, but to what made it possible. He said so sometimes briefly, in the way of a man for whom brevity was simply the shape language took, and she had learned to hear the weight behind the short sentences. Ivy started helping with the accounts properly in January, not just watching but working, sitting across from Harriet at the kitchen table, with her mother's careful slope to her numbers and her own particular attention to the details that didn't add up. She had questions, good ones. She wanted to know why certain things were logged, one way and not another, why the timber contracts were structured the way they were, whether there was a better way to track the cattle count through the season. There might be, Harriet said. Let's figure it out. They figured it out together. It took 3 weeks and several versions of a new ledger format that Ivy designed, and Harriet approved with a single change. Edmund, by spring, had taken over the daily management of the cattle, with a quiet competence that surprised even Silas, who'd seen him working since childhood. He'd turned 13 in the winter, and something had settled in him, some decision about the kind of person he intended to be, and he was working from that decision, with the same methodical patience he brought to everything else. One evening in April, Harriet stood at the kitchen window watching Edmund check the fence line in the long early light, and Ivy sitting on the porch steps doing something with a ledger page, and Silas coming up from the lower barn, with the particular walk of a man who is tired from good work, rather than from fighting something. She thought about St. John. She thought about the boarding house, and the chair in the corner, and Mr. Foss reading a number from a ledger like it was scripture. She thought about what it meant to come to a place as an outside thing and become, over time, a part of how it ran. Not by replacing what had been there, but by learning its specific shape and finding where she fit inside it. The debt was paid. She had paid it by mail in full in February and had received a receipt and nothing else, which was exactly right. The accounts for Croft property were in her handwriting now, mostly, with Ivy's appearing more often along the margins. The kitchen garden was planted in the rows that Margaret had laid out years ago, which Harriet kept because they were good rows, because some things were worth keeping. Silas came in through the back door and stood behind her for a moment, looking through the window at what she was looking at. Good fence line, he said. Edmund knows what he's doing, she said. He got that from his mother. A pause. And maybe something from you. Harriet turned from the window. He was looking at her in that specific way that still after months made her feel precisely and exactly seen. Something from me, she said. You showed him it was worth paying attention. He already knew how. He'd stopped thinking it mattered. Silas said it plainly, without sentiment, which was how he said things that mattered most. Outside, Ivy said something that made Edmund look up from the fence post and shake his head, and Ivy said something else, and he almost smiled. Harriet watched them. She had not expected to belong to a place. She had expected to survive one, and if she was fortunate to work, and if she was more fortunate still to be paid fairly for it. She had not planned on the valley or the accounts, or the twins, or the particular way a quiet man looked at you when he thought you weren't paying attention, and when it turned out you both were. You did not always get to choose the shape your life took. She knew that. Some shapes were chosen for you, by debt, or by grief, or by the particular cruelty of bad luck, and the question that mattered was not whether you liked the shape, but what you were going to build inside it. Harriet Cooke had built something she hadn't expected and could not have planned. She was still building it now.